Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for allowing us to, the opportunity to gather, inshallah, virtually in this first time Legacy Institute intensive and workshop with Sheikh Salman on advanced Quran study. Alhamdulillah, the people here should have a prerequisite in obviously Arabic and some level of understanding in Islamic sciences. What we look to do, inshallah, in the Legacy Institute is to present these kind of dawrat which go into some level of depth in the different sciences and discussing the evolution of the sciences and the application of the sciences. And something that, you know, we tend to see in other programs and other institutes, alhamdulillah, setting a foundation. So we want to present a level of depth, inshallah, and providing substance to the topic and breaching development in the fields, inshallah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us in doing that in this endeavor. We thank you all for participating, alhamdulillah. And honestly, an unprecedented response. MashaAllah, a lot of people that have interest, and it shows you that people are looking for that level of depth. And we look to provide it, inshallah, as best as we can. We also look forward to your criticism and your feedback. We will give you a survey, inshallah, at the end of the dawrah to see where we can improve on. We ask that you forgive us our shortcomings. And inshallah, the recording for the audio and the video will be provided, inshallah, after every single session. And we ask again that please do not share it with anyone. That was a condition of accepting being in this program. That if anyone who has any kind of financial problems, etc., they just need to email us at admin@legacy.institute, and they're welcome to attend the class, inshallah, if there's any issues. But please do not share it. And that's an amana we hope that you all fulfill. The video link will be unlisted YouTube links that you should not be sharing with others, inshallah, only for your purpose. In any case, I'll let Sheikh Salman continue. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa sahbihi ajma'in. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala benefit in this and accept from all of us, ya Rabbi. Jazakumullah khair.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salamu ala sayyidil anbiya wa mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa tabi'in lahum bi ihsan ila yawmiddin. Ba'd. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. In these trying times, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make this month of Ramadan a blessed month in spite of the difficulties that we're all going through, for us and for the whole of the Muslim Ummah and for mankind. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. I'm just going to get right to it without too much hassle with the formalities. As you know, this course is dealing with Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, and in particular, what we wanted to do was look at Uṣūl al-Tafsīr more from an applied perspective than from a theoretical perspective. So what we'll be doing in this course, we will be discussing some theoretical issues of Uṣūl al-Tafsīr. Other than this introduction, for the most part, we will focus on dealing with those issues as they come up as we go through the books of Tafsir. So basically what we will be doing is I'm planning on looking at Surah Al-Ikhlas across various books of Tafsir, and just to see how different Mufassirin have explained the surah, what sort of analysis we find in each Tafsir. Also take a look at how each Mufassir is building on the work of those who have gone before him. What is he adding? Is he adding anything? Is he objecting to something that someone said before? Is he bringing a new element to the discussion? Is he using some principle? Is he employing some tool of tafsir that maybe we haven't seen with others before him, etc.? So in this fashion, we can see this will be a chance to see a lot of these theoretical discussions of tafsir at work. This will be a chance to see those this will be a chance to see those theoretical discussions of tafsir at work. And to appreciate, or rather I should say, those theoretical issues, we'll get a chance to see how they're at work and how they're being used by different mufassirin. And furthermore, we will get a picture of how the tafsir literature has developed. And so this is something that is, in practical terms, it's of considerable importance, because oftentimes what I find is that a lot of people who are students of knowledge studying tafsir, particularly people who are in the earlier stages in study, or maybe even people who have progressed considerably in their study of tafsir, but from other angles, their focus is more on other things than on tafsir. And so they're, rather what I mean to say, people who have progressed considerably in their studies, but perhaps have not had as much focus on tafsir, or even if they've had a good bit of focus on tafsir. Oftentimes, a lot of people you'll find don't have great familiarity with how exhaustive the tafsir literature is. They don't know all of its various works and the features of those works. So this is a chance to explore the tafsir literature in a fashion where you will see sort of how certain discussions in the books of tafsir are developing chronologically. Because for the most part, as we will see, no mufassir is working entirely in a vacuum. There is this considerable literature that exists, particularly the tafsir literature, but even you have dictionaries, etc. We will see how there are mufassirin are actually looking at this and interacting with it and building on it. And so that will be valuable to you in the future when you yourself are reading tafsir, researching tafsir, attempting to do your own tafsir. Now that's a very high maqam, to be interpreting the Quran for yourself rather than simply reading and understanding the interpretation of other scholars. But nonetheless, as you're doing that in the future, having this familiarity with the literature of tafsir will be immensely useful for you in preparing lessons, in doing research, on whatever level of engagement with tafsir you're looking to have. The other benefit of this is that oftentimes, theoretical discussions are nice, and they're important in their own place, but when you don't see how they're being implied and how they're being used in a context where a host of people are approaching the same issue from different angles, you don't necessarily get the same appreciation. So, for example, I can discuss with you, Sabab al-Nuzul. Knowledge of Asbab al-Nuzul is very important and has certain benefits, and this is how you deal with it. And here are some examples. And that is fine. But when you, for example, when you come to an ayah where there's a number of factors involved, and so, someone has a particular qaida of Usul from Dalalat al-Alfaz, someone has a qaida from one of the ulum of the lugha, nahu, sarf, balagha, etc. All of these things that they're bringing into play, and they're looking at it from different angles and perhaps reaching different conclusions, then it's not quite as simple as, well, here's a sabab al-nuzul, or here's this qaida, and let me plug it in and use it, because mufassirin will differ. And so navigating that difference is important as well. So I'm hoping that by approaching this issue from in an applied fashion, that we will be able to get some unique benefits that perhaps we wouldn't if we focus just on the theoretical aspect. With that said, the way that we're going to be exploring this, we're focusing mainly on Surah Al-Ikhlas, although as I mentioned, I'm going to try and bring in examples from other places as well. While this has some benefits, there can also be a downside. The downside is that since the our focus is going to be somewhat narrow in terms of what we're looking at, that will also narrow the scope of the different issues of the different types of nadar, the different types of analysis and tafsir that are involved with verses that we're going to be taking a look at. Because if we were to explore, for example, the whole of Surah al-Baqarah, we see in Surah al-Baqarah you had all sorts of, being such a large text, you would have a host of different issues that would come up that maybe won't come up when we're looking at Surah al-Ikhlas. But the downside of that would be that you would not be able to explore as many tafsirs when you're doing Surah. I mean, realistically, in a class of 8 sessions, we wouldn't be able to focus Surah al-Baqarah anyway. But for the sake of argument, suppose we had a longer surah. The more of the text of the Quran we're studying, the less chance we'll have to see the relationship between the different works of tafsir. And so I was hoping, since this is going to be a short course, we only have 8 sessions, as opposed to in a longer course, we might have maybe double that or more than that. I figured that the benefit of being able to look at and explore the features of more works of tafsir is more important as an introduction than to look at theoretical issues, even if we get the chance to look at more theoretical issues. Because once you've gotten the hang of navigating the tafsir literature, and also you have some sort of framework for understanding what is Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, well, you can always carry on reading on it and learning more for yourself. So this is, I think, it's a nice sort of middle ground between the trade-off between covering more of the Qur'an, but being able to look at less tafsirs, and also being able to possibly look at more issues of Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, and between looking at certain number of issues of Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, but exploring in depth through a host of different tafsirs. So without further ado, what we want to discuss today is how have ulama defined tafsir and Uṣūl al-Tafsīr. If we're talking about Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, we want to have an idea about what is Uṣūl al-Tafsīr. And so the purpose of our discussion, it's not the typical, oftentimes you might have seen, for example, in books of Usul al-Fiqh, that you get a lot of back and forth debate about defining certain terms, and this definition is better than this definition, or this definition is naqis because it's worded this way, but it should have been worded that way. I'm not really interested in that. Our purpose here is that if we're going to speak about Usul al-Tafsīr, we need to have a good concept of what tafsir is. And Usul al-Tafsīr as a genre, I'm not going to get into the history of how Usul al-Tafsīr developed, but really Usul al-Tafsīr sort of as a dedicated genre it's a relatively modern phenomenon. In the past, you didn't really have scholars speaking about a separate ilm called ilm Usul al-Tafsīr. Even one of the most famous works that is known in this field, you have the Muqaddimah of Ibn Taymiyyah fi Usul al-Tafsīr. He didn't actually call it that. That title was given to it by another scholar, by a contemporary scholar, the Hanbali Mufti of Damascus. When he published this work, he gave it that title, Muqaddimah fi Usul al-Tafsīr. Otherwise, it simply begins with Ibn Taymiyyah answering a question that some of his students asked him. Some of his students, or one of his students, asked him to write a work containing qawaid kulliyya, general principles, universal principles, by which to judge tafsir. How is tafsir done, and how to sift the aqwal of tafsir. So the term Usul al-Tafsīr, while it exists before the modern era, as a genre, it doesn't really exist. So it is important to define what exactly it is we mean when we speak about Usul al-Tafsīr. Now, in the reading that I had given you guys, there's a discussion from Sheikh Musa'id al-Tayyar in his book al-Tahrir fi Usul al-Tafsir, which is this book, Tahrir fi Usul al-Tafsir. So I've given you this to read, al-Tahrir fi Usul al-Tafsir. And now I know that not everyone is going to be able to read through the materials that I've given, so that's perfectly all right. It's understandable. But if you're able to get through some of the reading, that would be better. Now, just very quickly, if you take a look, when he speaks about usul, he defines usul saying هي الأسس التي يعتمد عليها علم ما بحسب إضافته إلى علم من العلوم. Okay, so basically, the usul, when we speak about usul in an academic context, it means principles that are fundamental to a certain science. Then he defines tafsir, saying tafsir is بيان معاني القرآن الكريم. So tafsir is to explain the meanings of the Quran. Okay, so far so good. So therefore, on that basis, he defines Uṣūl al-Tafsīr. Here he defines Uṣūl al-Tafsīr as al-Usus al-Ilmiyya التي يرجع إليها المفسر حال بيانه بمعاني القرآن وتحريره للاختلاف في التفسير. So these are the sort of the fundamental principles that a mufassir refers to when he is explaining the Quran, the meanings of the Quran, and also when he is judging the difference of opinion concerning tafsir. He then goes on a few pages later when he discusses أهم مسائل هذا العلم. He says it's three things: مصادر التفسير وطرقه، الاختلاف في التفسير أسبابه وأنواعه. Why does الاختلاف happen? And what are the various types of اختلاف? And then finally قواعد التفسير, which is divided into two categories: القواعد العامة and قواعد الترجيح. القواعد العامة, he means by that general principles that can be used to make tafsir, and by قواعد الترجيح he means principles that can be used to weigh the different opinions of mufassirin. Okay, so this is basically how he conceptualizes Uṣūl al-Tafsīr. Just very quickly, just so that things are clear, in his other book, فصول في أصول التفسير, he defined أصول التفسير saying الأسس المقدمات العلمية التي تعين على فهم التفسير وما يقع فيه من الاختلاف وكيفية التعامل معه. Basically the same thing but expressed differently. This is another popular work in Usul al-Tafsir. This is a modern work in Usul al-Tafsir called علم أصول التفسير محاولة في البناء. The science of Usul al-Tafsir, an attempt to develop the field, to build. So this is, the title, there's an acknowledgement. This is a relatively new field, and it's still very early in its development. This is by a Moroccan scholar named Mawlay Umar ibn Hamad, Dr. Mawlay Umar ibn Hamad. So he has a long discussion about Usul al-Tafsir and different ways in which this term has been used in the past and by contemporary scholars as well. In the end, he defines what he intends by Usul al-Tafsir. He says, علم يحدد مصادر التفسير بكتاب الله تعالى ويضع قواعده ويحدد شروط المفسر لبيان الطريقة المثلى في التفسير وفق مقاصد المفسر. It's mufassar with the fatha on the scene. He says that this is a science that defines or identifies the masadir of tafsir, the sources of tafsir, basically the sources that are used to make tafsir of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it lays out its qawaid, the qawaid of that tafsir. ويحدد شروط المفسر, and it lays out the requirements to be a mufassir. in order to clarify the ideal fashion in which tafsir should be carried out such that it accords with the intended meanings of the text that is being explained, al-mufassar. So it's not, in terms of how he's defined the concept, I don't think it's that much different from what Sheikh Musa'id has mentioned. You'll find other definitions, but a lot of contemporary discussions revolve around Uṣūl al-Tafsīr in the sense of principles for tafsir. That's all fine. That's good and fine. And the point that Sheikh Musa'id has made about Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, it involves, or tafsir itself involves explaining the meanings and also, weighing different opinions when others have explained the meanings of the Quran. So both of those elements are part of tafsir. Up until here, I would say basically, so far so good. Where things start getting a little bit trickier is if we actually attempt to examine in detail a little bit, what does Sheikh Musa'id al-Tayyar actually mean by tafsir? Because he has a sort of particular understanding of what constitutes tafsir and what does not. And so towards this end, this is a topic that you'll find he's mentioned in explaining his definition of tafsir. He talks about it a good bit in a number of places in his books. So, for example, in his PhD, which is his PhD thesis is called the Tafsir al-Lughawi al-Qur'an al-Kareem. He talks about what constitutes tafsir and what doesn't there. He's written a dedicated work on this topic as well, which is what you see here on your screen. Mafhum al-Tafsir wal-Ta'wil wal-Istinbat wal-Tadabbur wal-Mufassir. So he wants to define what falls under these concepts and what doesn't. And really, it's an important work to look at and try and understand what he's saying about all of these topics. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on his discussion of tafsir. This is a very lengthy discussion, so I'm just going to try and go through it very quickly. So, moving ahead, here you see he starts speaking about al-ma'lumat al-warida fi kutub al-tafsir. So he wants to basically take a quick sort of look at what are the types of things that come up in tafsir. So first he mentions we have actual tafsir, direct tafsir of the meanings of the verses. So for example, وَالسَّمَاءِ ذَاتِ الْبُرُوجِ, al-buruj means al-nujum. فيكون المعنى يقسم ربنا تعالى بالسماء صاحبة النجوم, ذات النجوم. So al-buruj means al-nujum. This is tafsir. Then the next example he mentions, the next category he mentions is that he says you have معلومات تفيد في تقوية بيان المعنى وبهذا تكون أقرب إلى علم التفسير من غيرها والفرق بينها وبين سابقها أن المعنى يكون قد اتضح وبان وهذه المعلومات تزيده وضوحا وتقويه بحيث لو جهلها المفسر فإنها لا تؤثر على فهم المعنى المراد. So basically what he's saying is that you have some things that they help understand the meaning, but the meaning they're not essential. They're not actually essential. They are supplementary and help in understanding the meaning. So the example that he mentions, he explains about the ishtiqaq of the word buruj. Baraja fi al-lugha tadul ala al-dhuhur wal-buruz. And then the various examples that are used to explain that, the meaning of the ishtiqaq. Then he mentioned istinbatat amma fi al-adab wal-fiqh. So basically for this he means anything that is beyond al-ahkam al-sariha fi al-ayah. So for him this is now falls under the category of istinbat. He does not consider this to be tafsir. This is important because when he excludes something from tafsir, that means that the tools that are used for arriving at that meaning, since they're not part of tafsir, they're not part of the usul of tafsir. So this will have ramifications on how he understands Tafsir and Usul al-Tafsir and our discussion of Usul al-Tafsir. But in any case, he mentioned some examples here. He says, وَامْرَأَتُ حَمَّالَةَ الْحَطَبِ in Surah Al-Masad. He mentions the example that Imam Suyuti quotes the Shafi'i is saying that this verse is an evidence that the marriage contracts of the kuffar are valid. This is not because this is not essential to understand the ayah. You can understand the ayah without this piece of information. This is then extraneous. It's not tafsir. So anything that is beyond ahkam sariha that are clearly stated in the ayah, because if it's clearly stated in the ayah, then it needs to be explained to understand the ayah. But since this is not clearly stated in the ayah, this is not for him part of tafsir. He then goes on, he mentions لطائف وملح تفسيرية. Now note the example that he gives for لطائف وملح تفسيرية. It says بعث هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منه. Says that this indicates, or some people have said, أنه يفيد أن هؤلاء كانوا موتى باعتقاداتهم فبعث الله لهم النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ليحييهم. Okay, so Allah, without getting into whether or not this deduction is correct, does ba'atha here actually give a sense that the Quran is essentially saying that they were as if they were dead spiritually, and so Allah sent them the Prophet to revive them? Without getting into whether or not that's correct, because I'm not very convinced of that. But if we were to say, for the sake of argument, that this was correct, is this not a meaning that is present in the verse? It is a meaning that is present in the verse. But he doesn't consider this essential to tafsir, so he calls this لطائف وملح تفسيرية. Then he mentions معلومات علمية تتعلق بعلوم القرآن. He goes on to mention معلومات علمية عامة في شتى المعارف الإسلامية وغيرها. So we have these different these other things, and it's true that, and if you read books of tafsir, you will find that depending on the work that you're studying, that various mufassirin have included things that are not technically speaking part of tafsir. They're not essential for understanding the ayah. They might not even be derived from the ayah. It's just simply, the ayah mentioned something, and so the mufassir has taken that as an opportunity to go on a tangent and discuss that topic. And you will find various mufassirin do this. So, for example, al-Qurtubi does this a lot when it comes to fiqh. When a fiqh issue comes up, Qurtubi has a tendency that all related fiqh issues, even if they're not in any way derived from the verse, he will list them and discuss them, and he'll mention a call concerning them. So that yes, it can be said clearly that that is something that is extraneous to tafsir of the verse. It might be useful information for the person who is reading that verse or not, but in terms of explaining the verse, it's not really in any way fundamental to explaining the verse. Likewise, others will go on tangent on other things, depending on the nature of the work or the interest of the mufassir. So, for example, Al-Razi is famous for his lengthy kalam discussion, sometimes which may or may not be relevant may or may not be essential to understanding the meaning of the verse that he's discussing. Likewise, he will discuss things related to the natural sciences and what have you. Ibn Kathir, in his tafsir, anytime a verse comes up, if there are hadiths from the Prophet ﷺ that are related to the topic of that verse, it doesn't have to be that they're actually explaining the verse, but simply the verse is on this topic, these hadiths are also on this topic, he will list them. And sometimes even those unrelated hadiths might actually be useful to the mufassir. They might be useful to the mufassir, and oftentimes they're just additional information. it's obviously it's hadith of the Prophet ﷺ is good information to have, but it's not tafsir. So to an extent, there is truth to what Sheikh Musa'id is saying here, that there are things that you find in the books of tafsir that are not strictly speaking tafsir. But nonetheless, there is some issue here in terms of what does he count as being part of tafsir and what does he not count as being part of tafsir. So when we come and we'll take a look at he lists definitions that various ulama have given for tafsir, Ibn Juzay, Abu Hayyan, others. We won't really get into their definitions. Zarkashi, Ibn Arafa, Kafiyaji. So he mentions a number of these ta'rifat, and he makes an objection that a number of them have. Here he makes this point that they have included a number of the ulum of tafsir, ulum of Qur'an, in the definition of tafsir. And he says that this comes back to the fact that they haven't distinguished between ulum al-Qur'an and tafsir. So there are things that, if it's derived from the Qur'an, he would consider it part of ulum al-Qur'an. But if it doesn't meet his definition of tafsir, it is not part of tafsir. And his point is not that these things don't belong in a book of tafsir, it's just that these are not actually part of tafsir. This is something additional. So then you see here also objects to Ibn Arafa adding ilm al-i'jaz to tafsir. Not that ilm al-i'jaz is not important or that it shouldn't be explored or that the mufassir shouldn't explore it in his tafsir, but that it is not tafsir. This is his point. He then goes on, he discusses az-Zamakhshari. Az-Zamakhshari in particular is important because az-Zamakhshari, as we will see, when az-Zamakhshari's tafsir came around, az-Zamakhshari created a shift in the way in which tafsir was written. So, and in his introduction, he says that basically the most important ulum for the mufassir, without which he cannot make tafsir, are ilm al-ma'ani and ilm al-bayan. Basically, these two sciences of ilm al-balagha. So, az-Zamakhshari says that the most important ulum for the mufassir are ilm al-ma'ani and ilm al-bayan. For Sheikh Musa'id, however, he says, إذا تأملت هذا العلم الذي نص عليه الزمخشري أي علم البلاغة وجدت أنه إنما يحتاجه من كان عمله زائدا عن مهمة التفسير كمن يريد بيان إعجاز القرآن الكريم ببلاغته، إنه لا شك بحاجة إلى التبحر في علم البلاغة ليبين البلاغة القرآنية، ولكن هذا ليس من مهمة المفسر. الله أعلم. So basically, from az-Zamakhshari, and then you have a whole host of awashi that were written on the tafsir of Zamakhshari. Then it was summarized and adapted by al-Baydawi, and al-Baydawi has a host of hawashi. Al-Razi uses it heavily. Ibn Abu Hayyan refers to it heavily. Most of the mufassirin after az-Zamakhshari, for them, az-Zamakhshari is a fundamental reference point. Abu Su'ud comes along and he writes a very important Balaghi tafsir, which is building on az-Zamakhshari and al-Baydawi's work. Later, and eventually you have finally al-Alusi and Ibn Ashur in the modern era are also building on this trend that az-Zamakhshari starts of employing ilm al-ma'ani and ilm al-bayan, employing basically the tools of balagha in the works of tafsir. And this then becomes a general trend in the books of tafsir. That this now is an important focus of the mufassir. According to Sheikh Musa'id, this is something additional to tafsir. It is part of explaining the ijaz of the Quran, but it is not part of tafsir. I think it can be said in defense of what Sheikh Musa'id is saying here, that it is true that before az-Zamakhshari, that the Mufassirin of the past, because az-Zamakhshari really is the first one to use ilm al-ma'ani and ilm al-bayan in this fashion. And just to understand the historical background, Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani writes his famous books Asrar al-Balagha and Dalal al-Ijaz, and these two books essentially become in sort of mature form the sciences of ilm al-ma'ani and ilm al-bayan. Dalal al-Ijaz is ilm al-ma'ani and Asrar al-Balagha is ilm al-bayan. Az-Zamakhshari is the first to really use these two sciences for the purpose of writing a tafsir. And it comes out very clearly in the tafsir that is written. And it's such an important tafsir that, in spite of the fact that he was a Mu'tazili, and he was a Mu'tazili in the 6th century Hijri, this is at a time at which the madhab of i'tizal had almost completely died out in the Islamic world. There's hardly any Mu'tazila left anywhere, except for in his corner of Khwarizm, where he was from. And you also had pockets of Zaydis in certain places, which includes, at his time, you had the rulers of Makkah were actually Zaydis. And so the Zaydis were basically Mu'tazila. You'll find him allude to this in his, he alludes to the fact that he's writing, or rather he mentions it explicitly, that he's writing his tafsir at the request of the Amir of Makkah at his time, who was a Zaydi Sharif. So and the reason for this affinity that he has for az-Zamakhshari is because az-Zamakhshari is a Mu'tazili. As far as I can tell, az-Zamakhshari does not self-identify as Zaydi, although one of his teachers is al-Hakim al-Jushami, who was also himself wrote an important work of tafsir. Al-Hakim al-Jushami, it seems, did possibly identify as Zaydi, but it's not clear. There are indications from his works that he identifies as a Zaydi. But there was generally a very close affinity between the Mu'tazila in general and then sort of, I guess, what we call the Zaydi wing of the Mu'tazila in his time. But regardless, the point being that by his time, the Mu'tazili sect is a very remote sect. It doesn't have a very large presence in the Muslim world as it had at one point. It's basically in its death throes, you could say. In spite of that, Sunni scholars from around the world came to study his tafsir with him. It's quite funny because when you read his tafsir, you will see that whenever he gets the opportunity, and this comes back to the issue we were discussing of mufassirin including things in their tafsirs that are not necessarily taken from the verse or essential to explaining the verse. Basically, Zamakhshari with munasaba and not without munasaba makes it a point to big up the Mu'tazila at every opportunity and to take jibes at Ahl Sunnah. So you have all these big Sunni scholars coming from around the world and studying this tafsir with him. They're studying this tafsir with him, and then so they're studying this tafsir with him and hearing these comments throughout the tafsir. And this tafsir then it goes on to become a fundamental teaching text that Sunni scholars across the world are teaching. In fact, Ibn Ashur goes as far as to say, Ibn Ashur wrote an essay on identifying who are the mujaddids of the Ummah throughout history. And he goes through the standard list that some scholars had made before him. He says, look, these guys, if you look at the list that they made, they just chose Shafis because they're Shafi. And they didn't really look at what does tajdeed mean. And so he says, I'm going to make my own list based on my own ijtihad and who I think is the mujaddid of every century. And so, unfortunately, this essay, it's published, but a piece of it is lost because the publisher, when he found an incomplete copy of it. And so in the middle, right when it's getting juicy, there's a big gap in the discussion. So basically, the beginning of his discussion about az-Zamakhshari is lost, but there's enough there from the end to gather that Ibn Ashur considers az-Zamakhshari to be the mujaddid of the Sharia in his century. And the reason is because of his contribution to tafsir. So, what Sheikh Musa'id is saying here then is a radical departure from the way that scholars post az-Zamakhshari. We're talking about this. Az-Zamakhshari dies in 538 Hijri. So we're exactly 903 years since his passing. So for the last 9 centuries, the way that the bulk of scholarship has seen tafsir, what Sheikh Musa'id is saying here is a radical departure from that. So this is a very important point. Okay, so if you he then goes on in this discussion to look at an example. Basically, he wanted to take this idea that he had about what constitutes tafsir and what is supplemental to tafsir, but not part of it. He wanted to give an example to illustrate his point. So he gives an application to Surah al-Kawthar. So if we just look quickly, al-Kawthar, he mentions that there are basically 2 different interpretations of what is al-Kawthar. So al-Kawthar is either a shay' al-kathir, and the meaning would be inna wahabnaka shay'an kathira. And this would include all khair that Allah has given to the Prophet sallallahu khair al-dunya, khair al-akhirah, the Qur'an, having many followers, etc. The second interpretation is that al-Kawthar means the river in Jannah called al-Kawthar, which was granted to him. And so therefore the meaning would be inna wahabnaka nahr al-Kawthar alladhi fil Jannah. وفي الكوثر غير هذه الأقوال. Anyway, قال أبو حيان معلقا عليها وينبغي حمل هذه الأقوال على التمثيل. So in reality, he says basically it comes back to there's 2 different interpretations. Knowing that there's these 2 different interpretations, making some sort of determination on them, which one is more correct, this for him is tafsir. He then goes on, he discusses the rest of the verse, but I just wanted to take a look at that example. And then when he comes back to, when he comes to this next section where he talks about al-ma'lumat allati ta'ti ba'da tafsir. I agree with him that some of these things are not tafsir. Like for example, the name of the surah, some discussion on the name of the surah, the number of, the fact that it's the shortest surah in the Qur'an. I mean, you could say that really, it's technically speaking, it's not actually explaining the meaning of the surah. It's just a piece of information about the surah. But here, consider this. Ibn Ashur lists أغراض السورة وهي جملة الموضوعات التي طرحتها السورة. Is not, in my view, looking at the surah and saying that, and this is particularly more clear when you look at longer surahs. Ibn Ashur in every surah he will list أغراض السورة. By أغراض السورة basically means these are the topics that are covered in the surah. Isn't giving the reader sort of a bird's eye view of this is what the surah is covering, would that not be part of bayan of the surah? I mean, so for me, I find this problematic here. He says, لأنه لا أثر له في بيان الآيات. That might be the case here in this example, but I'm not even sure that I agree that there would be no athar for knowing aghrad al-surah in terms of these are the mawdu'at that are covered in the surah, on explaining the meaning of the verses. Yeah, looking at an individual verse and saying this means either this or this, fine. But if in the process of looking at this individual verse, I'm looking at the whole of the surah and saying, well, because the surah has discussed this, because this and this, the overall context of the surah suggests that this meaning is stronger. So here in this case would not, aghrad al-surah be something that are important to, or has a role in explaining the verses. He goes on to mention ذكر الطاهر بن عاشور بعض النكات البلاغية. So again, very clearly, he's saying that meanings that are taken from basically ilm al-balagha, these are not part of tafsir. Okay, so with that said, I want to take a look at the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and I want to get your thoughts. Okay, this is Sahih al-Bukhari. You can see on the screen. Bab Tafsir Surat Idha Ja'a Nasrullah. Note that he hasn't given it the typical title An-Nasr. The An-Nasr in parentheses is from, I think that's from the Muhakkak. Tafsir Surat Idha Ja'a Nasrullah. And this is something you'll find is common in early works, that oftentimes when a surah is mentioned that doesn't have a tawqifi name from the Prophet ﷺ, oftentimes it's known simply by how it starts. Surat Idha Ja'a Nasrullah, Surat Qul Huwallahu Ahad, etc. Surat al-Ikhlas is not a name that was given by the Prophet ﷺ. He never uses the term Surat al-Ikhlas in any hadith. Likewise, Surat al-Nasr, it was not called that by the Prophet ﷺ. So you have names that are istilahiyya and names that are tawqifiyya. But this is an example of a surah that doesn't have a tawqifi name as far as I know. And this is why you find someone like al-Bukhari titling the chapter Tafsir Surat Idha Ja'a Nasrullah. So then he reports this hadith from Aisha. ما صلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم صلاة بعد أن نزلت عليه إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح إلا يقول فيها. So this is in Salah. سبحانك ربنا وبحمدك اللهم اغفر لي. This is why, what does the surah say? إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره. So فسبح بحمد ربك سبحانك ربنا وبحمدك واستغفره اللهم اغفر لي. So the Prophet ﷺ was given this command, and he fulfilled that command how? By making this dua in his salah. The next narration that he quotes, أن عائشة رضي الله عنها قالت كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يكثر أن يقول في ركوعه وسجوده سبحانك اللهم ربنا وبحمدك اللهم اغفر لي. So in this narration clarifies that the Prophet ﷺ was making this dua in his ruku' and his sujood. And so we can take from this that this command that was given by Allah to the Prophet ﷺ is intended to be carried out in ruku' and sujood. And maybe it could be said also that it's not limited to ruku' and sujood. The command is general, so you could make more tasbih and more hamd and istighfar, which is generally mashru' anyways. But this is actually a particular command to the Prophet ﷺ, and this is how he fulfilled it, at least according to what we know from Aisha radiallahu anha. And she says here, and يَتَأَوَّلُ الْقُرْآنِ. يَتَأَوَّلُ الْقُرْآن means basically carrying out what he was commanded in the Quran. Then he has two more hadiths in the next two chapters. باب قوله ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا. He says حدثنا عبد الله بن أبي شيبة عن سعيد بن جبير عن ابن عباس أن عمر رضي الله عنه سألهم عن قوله تعالى إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح قالوا فتح المدائن والقصور قال ما تقول يا ابن عباس قال أجل أو مثل ضرب لمحمد صلى الله عليه وسلم نعيت له نفسه. So إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح, he asked them, what do you say about this verse? They said فتح المدائن والقصور. This means that the various cities and castles will be conquered. This is in reference to that. إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح. قال ما تقول يا ابن عباس. Although as we'll see with the next hadith, there's different wordings, and some of them are more clear about what is the story that is going on. This hadith is actually reported in about 5 different places in Sahih Bukhari. Who says, what do you say, Ibn Abbas? Ibn Abbas says that this is either the lifespan, ajal, or he says, mathal. This is a parable that the Prophet is being given for the Prophet nu'iyat lahu nafsuhu. Basically, he's being given, na'i in Arabic means, giving the report of someone's death. Giving the report that someone has passed away. So basically, he's saying here that the Qur'an, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is informing him that his death is coming. This is basically the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is Allah giving the Prophet ﷺ news that he is going to die. Then the other version of this hadith, also from Sa'id ibn Jubair. The other one was, the one before was from Habib ibn Abi Thabit from Sa'id ibn Jubair. This is from Abu Bishr from Sa'id ibn Jubair. And this is the narration that you probably all know. Ibn Abbas says, كان عمر يدخلني مع أشياخ بدر, meaning elderly senior companions who had witnessed the Battle of Badr. So these are the very top-ranking companions. كان عمر يدخلني مع أشياخ بدر. When he would gather with the companions, senior companions for Badr, he would include Ibn Abbas in those gatherings. فكأن بعضهم وجد في نفسه فقال لما تدخل هذا معنا ولنا أبناء مثله. So it's as if بعضهم can mean some of them, or it can mean one person amongst them. And one of the narrations says that it was Abdurrahman ibn Auf who objected. That, why are you including him in our gathering? I mean, he's not senior like us, and we have sons who are in his same age. It's not appropriate for him to be with us. So Umar said, إنه من حيث علمت, meaning you know what his nasab is, you know the family that he belongs to and what his rank is. فدعاه ذات يوم فأدخله معهم فما رؤيت. This is Ibn Abbas speaking now. It says, I did not think except that he had called me so that he could show them my manzila. قال ما تقولون في قول الله تعالى إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح. فقال بعضهم أمرنا نحمد الله ونستغفره إذا نصرنا وفتح علينا. We've been commanded that to praise Allah and ask His forgiveness when we receive victory and lands are open to us. وسكت بعضهم فلم يقل شيئا. And some of them stayed quiet and didn't say anything. فقال لي أكذاك تقول يا ابن عباس. So he said to me, is this what you say, O Ibn Abbas? فقلت لا. قال فما تقول؟ قلت هو أجل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أعلمه له. He said, this is the lifespan of the Prophet ﷺ that he is informing him. Meaning he is informing him that his lifespan is coming to an end. His period of time is ending. That this is the end of it. So basically you say ajal here means the end. This is the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. He is informing. قال إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح وذلك علامة أجله. When the victory of Allah comes, when the help of Allah comes and the victory, the conquest, وذلك علامة أجل, and that is the sign of the end of your life. فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا. فقال عمر ما أعلم منها إلا ما تقول. He says, I do not understand from it, I do not know from it anything other than what you have just said. And so by that he established for them the maqam of Ibn Abbas. Okay, now I want to just ask you, based on this definition, Shaykh Musa'id's definition of tafsir, is what Ibn Abbas mentioned here part of tafsir or not?
It would seem that what the other Sahaba said would be more in line with tafsir, and what Ibn Abbas said wouldn't be considered.
Yeah, exactly. What the other Sahaba said, it seems, would be this, what this verse means. And what Ibn Abbas is saying would fall under, what Sheikh Musa'id has categorized as istinbat. So it's something. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to actually take a look at how has Sheikh Musa'id. Sheikh Musa'id has written a tafsir, short tafsir of Juz Amma, which he basically wrote in the style of a method. And I'm just going to read to you from his introduction where he makes very clear what his intent is in this work. It says, لم أدخل فيه العلوم التي يتطرق إليها المفسرون ويتوسعون بذكرها كعلم النحو وعلم البلاغة وعلم الفقه وغيرها، كما لم أدخل فيه الفوائد والاستنباطات التي هي خارجة عن حد التفسير، وبها تتمايز كتب التفسير في المنهج وتطول أو تقصر بسببها. So basically, as far as he's concerned, what he's including here is basically what is essential tafsir, without all of the added stuff that various books of tafsir, some of them add the i'rab, and some of them go to town on the balagha, and some of them, the fiqh and so forth. And so then he makes even clearer. He says, وَسَلَكْتُ فِي بَيَانِ هَذَا الْجُزْءِ وَتَفْسِيرِهِ طَرِيقَ الْمَتْن وَالْحَاشِيَةِ. So I'm going to write a matan that's on top, and then you're going to have footnotes, حاشية. أما المتن فجعلته في صلب التفسير وجعلته قدر المستطاع واضح المعنى سهل العبارة ما الحرص على بيان مفردات القرآن اللغوية في ثناياه. وأما so basically everything in the matan should be essential tafsir. أما الحاشية فجعلتها للاختلاف الوارد في التفسير عن السلف ولتوجيه أقوالهم وبيان سبب الاختلاف وذكر الراجح من الأقوال كل ذلك قدر الإمكان والله المستعان. And from the example that we saw in his book, Mafhum al-Tafsir, with Surah al-Kawthar, you see, إِنَّا أَعْطَيْنَاكَ الْكَوْثَرَ فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْحَرْ إِنَّ شَانِئَكَ هُوَ الْأَبْتَرُ. Looking at the first verse, he says, يخبر ربنا تبارك وتعالى نبيه عن هبته له ذلك النهر العظيم الذي في الجنة الذي اسمه الكوثر وهو جزء من الخير الكثير الذي أعطاه إياه. So he has chosen the approach that combines the meaning of Kawthar being specific to the river with the interpretation that makes it general. So he's combined the two. And so when he lists the aqwal, you'll see that he says al-awwal nahrun fil jannah, al-thani al-kawthar al-shay'u al-kathir huwa al-khayru al-kathir, just so in his book Mafhum al-Tafsir. So you see what he's done, and he's given here lengthy discussion about the wazn of al-kawthar and how that indicates its meaning, the role that plays in its meaning, and the lughawi meaning versus the shar'i meaning of the word al-Kawthar, because al-Kawthar being a river in Jannah is known from the Sharia, it's not known from the language. Whereas al-Kawthar meaning al-Khayr al-Kathir is known from the language. And then basically he gives his explanation for why he has chosen to explain the way that he has. Okay, so let's look at Surah al-Nasr. What does he do in Surah al-Nasr? We come to Surah al-Nasr. Look at what he says. إذا جاءك يا محمد من الله لك على قومك من قريش وجاءك فتح مكة. So he's identified al-Fath as Fathu Makkah, because that's actually something that there's some difference of opinion about. But he has favored that view. ورأيت, and in fact, if we look at the footnotes, ورد المجاهد وغيره أن الفتح فتح مكة. So I think that the other interpretations of Fath are possibly not mentioned by Tabari, because he mainly limited himself here to the aqwal that are mentioned in the Tabari. So he says, وَرَأَيْتَ قَبَائِلَ الْعَرَبِ تَدْخُلُ فِي الْإِسْلَامِ جَمَاعَاتٍ تِلْوَ جَمَاعَاتٍ فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ قَدْ دَنَا أَجَلُكَ فأكثر من طلب المغفرة من ربك ومن ذكره بأوصاف الكمال التي تدل على حمدك إياه إنه سبحانه يرجع لعبده المطيع بالتوبة فيتوب عليه وكان صلى الله عليه وسلم كثير الاستغفار والحمد بعد نزول هذه السورة. Okay, based on his methodology, yes, this tafsir is also by Sheikh Musa'id. Yes, I'm almost done, and then I'll open the full floor for question and answers. Okay, so note this explanation that he has given. فاعلم أنه قد دنا. He said ورأيت قبائل العرب تدخل في الإسلام جماعات تلو جماعات فاعلم أنه قد دنا أجلك. Then know that your ajal, the end of your life has come near. فأكثر من طلب المغفرة من ربك ومن ذكره بأوصاف الكمال التي تدل على حمدك إياه. So this is the meaning of استغفار and سبح بحمد ربك. إنه سبحانه يرجع لعبده المطيع بالتوبة فيتوب عليه. This is the meaning of إنه كان توابا. Okay. وكان صلى الله عليه وسلم كثير الاستغفار والحمد بعد نزول هذه السورة. I understand that there's a relationship between this last point that he's mentioned and the tafsir of the verse. And if he had said, the Prophet ﷺ then fulfilled this command in his salah, as is reported by Aisha, that would make more sense to me here, according to his system that he's working with. But otherwise, these two things that he's mentioned, and particularly فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ قَدْ دَنَا أَجَلُكَ, I'm not sure how this fits his definition of tafsir. And I think the reality is that this point is so famous because, number one, Ibn Abbas and Umar both said that this is the point of the surah. And it's in Sahih al-Bukhari. It's authentic as it can get. And consequently, and it's such an amazing point, it's such a beautiful point, that every mufassir who has done tafsir of the surah inevitably mentions it. I do not think you will find in 1400 years someone who has done tafsir of the surah and does not mention this point. And if anyone were to do so, any reader would immediately ask, any reader who knows anything about tafsir and has read any little bit of tafsir would immediately ask, why in the world has this point not been mentioned? I mean, he doesn't have to mention the actual hadith. I mean, if he's doing a very brief tafsir, like tafsir al-Jalalain or what have you, fine, don't mention the hadith. But this piece of information, it's essential, is it not? Every mufassir will mention it, no matter how brief his tafsir is. Even I think at Tafsir al-Muyassar and what does it Tafsir al-Muyassar? I'm going to this is Tafsir al-Muyassar. Okay, so not here in Tafsir al-Muyassar, they've noted that point. إذا وقع ذلك فتهيأ للقاء ربك. That is coming from the hadith of Ibn Abbas. Let's look at the Mukhtasar. And the Mukhtasar in particular I'm highlighting because the Mukhtasar was actually supervised by Sheikh Musa'id. فاعلم أن ذلك علامة على قرب انتهاء المهمة التي بدأت بها. I guess let's just, for fun, let's take a look at Jalalain. See what they said. وعلم بها أنه قد اقترب أجله وكان فتح مكة في رمضان. Okay, so علم بها أنه قد اقترب أجله. No matter how short the tafsir, everyone is mentioning this piece of information. Al-Wajiz is another extremely short tafsir. Let's see. أمره الله عز وجل أن يكثر التسبيح والاستغفار ليختم له في آخر عمره بالزيادة في العمل الصالح. So this point, ليختم له في آخر عمره بالزيادة في العمل الصالح. These are basically the shortest tafsirs that there are. If anyone would have an excuse not to mention extraneous information, it would be these tafsirs. But they've still included it. I'm almost certain that no tafsir is going to have left this piece of information out. And as far now, I just want you to consider in this incident when Ibn Abbas, or rather when Umar asked these companions, "What do you understand from the surah?" And then he asked Ibn Abbas, "Is this not the purpose of the surah? And is this not how the Prophet ﷺ understood the surah?" Now you could say that, well, the Prophet ﷺ is receiving wahi, the Prophet ﷺ did this, and so therefore, but the Prophet ﷺ didn't say that this is Allah telling me that my time has come to an end. Aisha told us that he started doing tasbih and istighfar in his Subhanaka Rabbana wa bihamdik Allahumma firli. He started saying this in his ruku and his sujood. So, you know, it still raises the question: where is this information coming from? How is this part of tafsir? And how did Ibn Abbas derive this? I think we can say that part of it derived this as well. We know when this surah was revealed, or rather Ibn Abbas would have known when the surah was revealed. Umar would have known when the surah was revealed. Prophet ﷺ's time was in fact close. Note this point that Sheikh Musa'id actually mentions here in the footnote. كذا فسر عمر بن الخطاب وحبر الأمة هذه السورة وهو فهم صحيح يوافق ما عليه هذه الشريعة من ختم كثير من الأعمال بالاستغفار كالصلاة وغيرها وكأن في هذا إشارة إلى انتهاء محمد الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم في هذه الحياة. So, in other words, Ibn Abbas is looking at the entirety of the Sharia. That it is the habit of the Sharia, it is the norm of the Sharia that we're asked to make istighfar at the end of our a'mal. Allahumma anta as-salam wa minka as-salam, tabarakta rabbana. What's the dua? Allahumma anta as-salam wa minka as-salam, tabarakta dhal jalali wal ikram. Astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah. We say this at the end of every prayer. Why? Because we're acknowledging that perfection is Allah's and it is from Allah. And inevitably there's shortcoming in our prayers. There's shortcoming in our actions. So anytime we finish our actions, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us those shortcomings. And so this is what Ibn Abbas is looking at this point. Umar and Ibn Abbas are looking at this point. And they're employing that piece of information in Tafsir of the verse. Now, if that is not istinbat, then I don't know what is. So in any case, we will conclude with that. Tomorrow, inshallah, we will discuss that if this is the case, if there is this problem with Sheikh Musa'id's understanding of tafsir, then how should we understand tafsir? In particular, we'll be looking at Sheikh Ibn Ashur's definition of tafsir and the ramifications of that for what is Uṣūl al-Tafsīr. And then with that out of the way, we will proceed with looking at Surah Al-Ikhlas. If anybody has any questions, I think there were a couple of questions.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Already that. Yeah, tafadhal.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to comment on something that I've noticed. So we're talking about Tayyar, and I'm no means trying to defend him. I opt more towards what Sheikh Zahrani said. But isn't Tayyar being consistent with his definition of tafsir being bayan al-ma'ani? Because if we look at, in the PDF document for the readings, if we look at page 17, he sort of outlined his methodology and what he includes in his definition. And from that is asbab al-nuzul. So couldn't it be argued that what Ibn Abbas radiallahu an is bringing forth is just a form of asbab al-nuzul? And therefore he's being consistent.
Okay. That would be fine if the relationship between the sabab al-nuzul and the meaning that was being identified was clear.
Okay.
Here, I don't think it is. Knowing that this happened at the end of the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. I'm not saying that it's something hidden, meaning it's not something that can be arrived at. But remember, even when he explains his definition of tafsir, he oftentimes says that, and he mentions this in the introduction to his Tafsir Juz Amma, that once the meaning of the verse has been made clear, like for example, I think he mentioned this with the example of my computer is frozen. That's fine. When he mentions the example of dalalat balaghiya, or he mentions the example of meanings related to the meaning of the word, he says that these things are not tafsir because the meaning of the verse is already known. The meaning of the verse is already known without this piece of information. And so this piece of information, even if it's a meaning that is coming from the verse, it is extraneous to the verse. Sorry, it's extraneous to tafsir. It might be very important. For example, he says that understanding the balagha and explaining the ijaz of the Quran is extremely important. It's just not tafsir, even if there are meanings that are being taken from it. Why? Because the meaning of the verse has already become clear. Now, for whatever reason, here he's decided that this piece of information is essential. But then, and I don't have a problem with that. I actually believe that it's essential. But then my question would be, if this is essential, like for example, one of the examples that he I don't remember it now. One of the examples had to do with in balagha taqdeem and ta'khir. He said that the taqdeem and ta'khir that is here in this verse, Zamakhshari or Ibn Ashur has taken from it this point that is being highlighted by the structure of the verse. Is that not a meaning that is in the verse? What is the dhabit for Sheikh Musa'id for what is essential meanings in tafsir? And what is not, in some places like this, is going to become, at least in my opinion, it's a bit murky. But I agree with you. Generally speaking, he is consistent. He has a notion of what he considers to be tafsir. He is not saying that these additional meanings that can be taken from the verse are not important, that they shouldn't be highlighted, that they shouldn't be explored. I mean, quite the contrary. I've heard him in lessons many times saying, and by the way, I should make clear that even though, here in this lecture, I've been largely criticizing this point that Sheikh Musa'id is making. Sheikh Musa'id is someone that I consider to be one of my teachers. I've attended many of his lessons, read many of his books, going back to about 2003. So 17 years I've been reading his works and listening to his lessons and attending them when I get the opportunity when he's here in Makkah. So he's someone I consider one of my most important teachers that I've benefited greatly from. But I strongly disagree with him about his definition of tafsir. If now someone might say that, well, this is his istilah and he's consistent with it, there's no problem. To an extent, I can say that's fine. But I do think that there are certain ramifications to this. Part of this is when identifying Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, what constitutes Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, he is necessarily going to exclude things that are to others essential. And you pointed that out with Dr.
Zahrani. Yeah.
His critique of the definitions of tafsir and the conclusion that he arrives at is very different in it. And it broadens the definition of tafsir where Sheikh Musa'id is trying to narrow it, such that tafsir includes the level of primary meanings and secondary meanings. The only thing that I can say for why Sheikh Musa'id would include this is that somehow or another this is for him at the level of primary meanings and therefore not istinbat. But the criterion for that is still, it's not very clear. I honestly think that if there was another surah for which there was a similar istinbat that was not as famous as this one is from Ibn Abbas, that he would call it istinbat rather than tafsir.
Okay.
And the reason that he has done that here is because this one is so famous that it's sort of, I would say it sort of just passed under his Ulum al-Qur'an detector, which distinguishes tafsir from Ulum al-Qur'an. Wallahu a'lam.
Jazakumullah khair.
Are there any other questions?
Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I was wondering, how much confidence can we say that Surah An-Nasr necessarily refers to the end of the Prophet's life if we find senior companions didn't come to that conclusion?
That's a good question. Quite frankly, I would say that, number one, Surah was revealed at the end of the Prophet's life. And so it's not surprising then that some of them, not only would some of them not have known this, some of them would not even necessarily have memorized the surah, in spite of the fact that it's a very short surah. That, might be strange, but particularly given that it was such a revealed so late. And the Sahaba would memorize some of the Quran. And there was a few Sahaba who were specialized in memorizing Quran, and so they memorized more of the Quran, and in some cases even all of the Quran. But Abdurrahman ibn Auf himself, who was one of the ones who objected to Ibn Abbas being included in this gathering, used to actually learn Quran from Ibn Abbas. So, it's not that unusual that that some of them would not be familiar with these points, particularly given that in reality this istinbat here is an istinbat khafi. It's not something that is obvious, and it's not something that was simply common knowledge. It's something that Umar, with his genius understanding of the Sharia, and Ibn Abbas with his brilliant understanding of the Sharia, they deduced. Reality is that, you know, the maqam of the companions who witnessed Badr in the deen and in Iman, there's no doubt about it. But in terms of ilm, not all of them were fuqaha, not all of them were ulama, like someone like Umar, like someone like Ibn Abbas, and others of the senior companions and younger companions who are known to have been ulama. So it's not that unusual. And genuinely, if you look at the evidence, all of the evidence points to this is what the verse intend. Although the evidence is subtle and it's hidden, but now that it's been brought out, it's quite generally has been accepted by, I think, pretty much all ulama. And I would add to that, you know, Umar, the maqam of Umar being what it is, his closeness to the Prophet ﷺ, his deep understanding of the Quran, his deep understanding of the Sharia, and the confidence with which he states that this is what the surah means, and he knows that others simply don't know this, which is the point of his test. So, I mean, I think that, you know, while that's a valid point that you raised, I don't think that it really calls into question that tafsir. But I'm glad you raised that point. That's actually an interesting observation. Okay, we have a bunch of questions here that are written, as well as you know, Ismail is raising his hand. Ismail, if you want to ask your question, you can take the mic or type it out.
Yeah, hello, assalamu alaikum. How are you, Sheikhna? I wanted to ask specifically about where does tafsir fall in a haykal, as now with this definition that we're reading, within the fact that we have ulum al-Qur'an, we have gharib al-Qur'an, mushkil al-Qur'an, sabab al-nuzul, all falling under ulum al-Qur'an. And then you have tafsir. Is there some umbrella science that all of these can fall under?
Well, what I would say is that, and this is something that Sheikh Musa'id himself says, that ulum al-Qur'an is a broader umbrella term, underneath which would fall tafsir and usul al-Tafsīr. And so some aspects of ulum al-Qur'an are relevant and essential to the work of the mufassir, and others are not. Like, for example, you know, the details about how the Qur'an was compiled and how it's written, and you know, certain types of issues like that come up in al-Itqan, for example, you're not really going to use them for tafsir. So it is sort of a broader category than tafsir. But basically, anything that plays a role in tafsir or is useful for tafsir, yes, it is part of, you know, the ulum of tafsir or usul al-Tafsir, if you like. Okay. Some of the other questions. Curious as to why Sheikh Musa'id al-Tayyar's definition was chosen for us to study in particular, as he appears to hold some views that one could disagree with. Okay, that's a good question. The reason that I chose to start with him is because his work at al-Tahrir fi Usul al-Tafsir is one of the most popular works of Usul al-Tafsir that have been written in the modern era. And he is one of the most important and most influential scholars concerning Usul al-Tafsir in the modern era, and ulum al-Quran in general. So, you know, you can't simply bypass what he has to say. So I felt that it needed to be addressed. And the concept of what is tafsir and what is not tafsir, and what constitutes part of tafsir as being part of tafsir and what doesn't, and then what are the ramifications of that for how we understand usul al-Tafsir, I felt something that is important, and that is a discussion that we will, inshallah, complete tomorrow. And so the contrast, I think, is also it's useful for its illustrative value in terms of understanding what really is tafsir and what constitutes tafsir, and therefore what does the mufassir need in order to do tafsir? Because someone could simply read Sheikh Musa'id's work, which I recommend reading. It's an important work. It's beneficial. He makes a lot. There's a lot that you will learn from it. But at the same time, he is, in terms of what constitutes tafsir for him, because he has this particular definition, what constitutes the usul of tafsir for him will also be influenced by this definition. And so I want the reader to understand that, well, this is an important work, beneficial work, that what tafsir constitutes is actually broader. And if it is broader, then the usul of tafsir must also therefore be broader than what he has defined it as and what he has focused on as the usul of tafsir. Okay, does not Shaykh al-Tayyar say on that page that asbab nuzul are not from the usul of tafsir? He might have. I'm not totally sure now. But basically, the answer to that would be that yes, but it is still a tafsir, a tool that is used in tafsir. Can one conclude that there is a certain level of authority of the ijma' of the past mufassirin due to the fact that you said that this point of Ibn Abbas was not excluded in any previous work of tafsir? I would say yes. Yes, there is, weight to ijma' al-mufassirin. But what does that mean? How does it work? That is a discussion yet to come. Al-Fawz al-Kabir. Al-Fawz al-Kabir is a nice work, but it's not necessarily strictly Usul al-Tafsir in the sense that we are defining it now. Because in Al-Fawz al-Kabir, he tries to identify certain major themes of the Qur'an and some other points that are, some of which will be part of Usul al-Tafsir. But in terms of identifying major themes of the Qur'an that are important to understand throughout the Qur'an, I'm not sure that they would constitute Usul al-Tafsir in the sense that we have spoken about it, but nonetheless, it is a valuable work and an important work to study. Jamaluddin, with regards to your question, I think I have already just answered it. I'm not sure. But basically, the idea is that while in considerable extent, it might just be semantics for Shaykh al-Tayyar, because he has his framework and he's consistent with that framework, and he's just using this particular terminology. The ramifications of it is going to be that when we look at what is necessary for the mufassir to do in tafsir and how he goes about doing that, and how these different tools come into play, that is going to be changed depending on how he has defined tafsir. Okay, so the next question. Okay, it seems that Shaykh al-Tayyar represents a shift in what is considered as tafsir. What is the catalyst of the reason? I think Allah Alam, I don't want to speculate too much, but I think one thing that I've found in reading his work, it seems that he feels that this level of tafsir, which is at the level of the primary meanings of the verses, determining that there are X, Y, Z number of aqwal in a particular verse, and then sort of determining the interpretation of that verse, that either this is the correct quote or this is the correct quote or this is the correct quote. I think maybe he feels that because of all of these extraneous discussions or these additional discussions, that this aspect of tafsir sometimes gets lost sight of. The focus on identifying these aqwal at the level of primary meaning of the verse and then doing tarjih between them. I think maybe he feels that this gets lost sight of, and so this maybe caused him to sort of laser focus in on this aspect of tafsir, which in and of itself, I would say, it was no doubt important. Basically, tomorrow we will look at the definition of Ibn Ashur in particular, and generally how ulama have understood tafsir and what the ramifications of that are for Usul al-Tafsir. The definition that Sheikh Musa'id gave for Usul al-Tafsir, where he has tafsir as bayan ma'ani al-Qur'an. I would say that that definition is fine. My problem with it is when he speaks about bayan al-ma'na, he actually means that once you know what the verse is saying, bayan al-ma'na is complete. Any additional explanation, any additional meanings are not actually bayan al-ma'na anymore, because the meaning is complete. If he would simply broaden that to include bayan al-ma'ani, meaning the primary meanings as well as the secondary meanings, or additional layers of meaning, then that would be fine. And so that would be fine in terms of the definition. But what would be the ramifications of that for, well, what do we actually include in Uṣūl al-Tafsīr? This is a bit of a problem because, as I said, this field is a field that is a relatively new field and it's not well developed because it's a modern field. As a separate genre of ilm, it is a modern genre. For that purpose, I would recommend going back, if you have time, in the readings I'd included a section from Sheikh Musa'id where it talks about Tarikh Uṣūl al-Tafsīr. Go back and read that because it does give you, although there might be some points that I don't agree with, it gives you a useful overview of how basically these theoretical discussions have developed historically without being necessarily, per se, a separate genre, the way that Usul al-Fiqh is its own genre with its own well-developed literature and has very much matured as a science that has well-defined parameters. That has not happened with Usul al-Tafsīr. And this is why this discussion is so important, because we're discussing something, we're trying to define something and study something, the parameters of which are not yet well-defined. On I'rab al-Qur'an, could the books of I'rab al-Qur'an, could they be called tafsir, in that they explain how to understand the meanings of the verses? They might not be books of tafsir per se, but they're certainly a genre. I would say that, yes, it's fair to say that books of I'rab al-Qur'an, because they are part of explaining the meanings of the verses, they are a subgenre of the literature of tafsir. Okay. I think that covers all the questions. Okay, people who have been sending messages, try and send the messages to everyone rather than privately, because I'm actually on phone as well as my computer. When you send me messages on the phone, I don't see them. Hamza? Yes, you have a question? Hamza is raising his hand. You can ask your question. Yes, Khalida. Yes, go ahead. Fadal. Feel free to use the microphone or type your question.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Wa alaikum salam.
For the readings, because to me there were a lot of PDFs, and Jazakallah khair for sending all those readings. But for me, I didn't get enough time to look through all of them, so I just read Lubab al-Tahrir al-Tafsir. Yeah. So, but I noticed that today we were looking into some sections, but I wish that I read the actual reading resource that we were using today. Should I read that for tomorrow's class?
Okay, if anyone has any questions on the reading, why don't you ask them in the group after we get done, and I'll explain there. Basically, because we're going to be moving on now from this point. If you understood what we discussed today, you probably don't want to get bogged down with the old reading, because we have plenty ahead of us. Maybe, after tomorrow, once we're done, you have a bit of time before the next week. Maybe if you want to use that time, get caught up on the reading, because there's still, from the readings that I'd given, in this file up until page 92, basically from after the discussions that we've read from Sheikh Musa'id up until page 92, there is now discussions from the book by the thesis of Dr. Zahrani, and also from Sheikh Ibn Ashur, that are important and will be relevant to tomorrow's discussion. So try and, if you're going to read, try and focus on those.
Okay, so that's in the advanced Quran study reading resource, that PDF specifically.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
I just want to ask, do you plan on perhaps uploading like a document with like a breakdown of what we're going to be doing in each session until the end of the 8 weeks? So you sort of have like an overview of the whole program, like in week 1, we're focusing on this, week 2, this, week 3, this.
Okay, basically the reading resources that I sent you for that basically covers most of what we're doing for the first week. For the rest of the course, we'll actually be going through tafsirs. Somebody's already put something together and sent it. I shared it, that goes through the major tafsirs, but there are some other ones that I'm going to be adding in as well. And I didn't want to send all of them at once because I don't want to throw too much stuff at you. But basically, that is what we will be reading. After tomorrow, we will jump into reading the tafsirs, looking at the individual tafsirs, tafsir of Surah Al-Ikhlas, starting from. We will start with we will actually start with Musa'id al-Tafsir al-Ma'thur, because that starts with narrations from the Sahaba and Tabi'in, because obviously their explanation chronologically comes first. So we will use that, even though it's it's actually a modern work, but it's compiling those narrations. So we will start with looking at that, and then we will go through chronologically. The books that are in the file that was sent are chronological, except for that one, because it's come at the end, because it's a modern work. But we'll start with reading it first, and then proceed from there. But there will be additional tafsirs that we will look at, even if just briefly, beyond the ones that are included in that file that was sent. Okay, I think that's everybody. Okay, subhanakallah wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi. Abdurrahman, you have a question?
Sorry, that happened by mistake. Henry. I'm done.